Good afternoon, everybody. This is a very informal presentation I put together. I'm trying to resonate with some of the main points that Willie brought up, and I hope you could let me know if it gets a bit too confusing. And you can see over here, with the ones that are named actually Little India, and the rest you're very familiar with. Top left, Mongkok, Hong Kong, and then down Kolkata. That's the part in Kumatuli, the Potter's Colony. The bund in Shanghai, if you look at the people, they are looking in one direction, definitely across the river to Putong, where the glitzy lights are. Dhaka, as you are, the famous home of the Dhaka Assembly. And the Kwansai Valley, which is in Chengdu, used to be the home of the Imperial Guards, and now it's been turned into a little bit like Holland Village. Now, if you look at the traffic situation, when you focus on Ho Chi Minh City, very interesting, probably intersection somewhere in District 1, one of the densest. And you find that over there, when you try and cross the road, you do not cross the road like that. You have to cross the road like this. And that's the way the people drive. You don't need traffic lights. The traffic police are vestigial. They do appear there. And really, it's a very self-regulating community. And you look at the slide to the right where you see a car that's piggybacking another one. That's Singapore, somewhere along West Coast Highway on my way to work. So the question is, if you do want to do away with traffic lights and speed limits and traffic cops, maybe we should change the way we drive and behave on the road, or examine closely the kind of culture that we are. Are the Vietnamese really much more patient than we are before they get on the road? And that matters. So really, next slide, please. That the question here is, when does it get too crowded? Now, in the early 1860s, it's a famous engineer, Spanish, Ildefonso Cerda. And he actually did a master plan for Eixample. I know you think it's spelled example, but it's Eixample in Catalonian. And they were actually targeting for that figure with a magic configuration of 113-meter blocks. And really, we're talking about 323,000 jobs per square kilometer. Let's think about that. And what was the thinking of the urban planners at that time? They'd just come out of the Industrial Revolution. This is 1860. Things were in a mess. All the environments were actually polluted. People were getting sick. They're looking for fresh air. Yeah, they're looking for healthy living conditions. At the same time, you have Ebenezer Howard, who's also looking at the Garden City. Yeah, and much later, you have Frank Lloyd Wright in the Broad Acres. And between, if you remember the famous story, Georges Eugene Haussmann and his plan for Paris for Napoleon III, they were all looking for not just a city that was healthy to live in, but beautiful for the people who lived in the city to take the time to stroll and to take on the street life and to enjoy it. Now, very much involved from the physical planning aspects is this fixation of physical proportions, where the best measures for airflow, light, and beauty were sought in some kind of a magic measurement. And minimum density now was associated with vibrancy. I think as early as the 1900s, Raymond Unwin thought it would be about 3,000 dwellings per square kilometer. Later, Jane Jacobs in 1960 said it would be 25,000 dwellings per kilometer squared. Now, the future city projections. And we have this crazy lab that's going on in our department that is looking into future cities. And we think that the projected population is 100,000 persons per square kilometer, 40,000 dwellings per square kilometer. In a Singapore context, currently with 5.3 million people, we're stuffing 1.2 million people, 1.2 million dwellings, 5.3 million people and 1.2 million dwellings. And if you want to hit 6 million, you need an additional 600K. That's the figure that we're talking about. Okay? Now let's move on. Oh, I just wanted to make the note, if you reverse, please. If you notice that there in the bottom left, the city of Barcelona was awarded the Royal Institute of British Architects Gold Medal Prize in 1999. And here, the British architects decided to award it to the city in honor of their mayors and planners who were into a bigger picture than architecture. Next slide. Now here's the question. Can cities and townships be planned for resilient economies? We seem to think that if you're strategic enough, you get onto the sunrise industries, nothing can happen. But really look what happened to Spain. You get this online. You have many townships that are built during the time of the Spanish boom, property boom. And then the subprime loans in the US happened, and they all went into, well, in despair. And what you find here is that it's a great deal of townships have been built over, they're waiting to be filled up, 1 or 2 people living in there. And it's a very desperate type of situation. And I think the lesson here is that one has to plan for some form of flexibility when you're hit by economic downturn. Now let's look at Chengdu Estate. What's that? Interestingly, I met up with an ex-student who's working now in Chengdu, and he showed me this grand upmarket housing estate running on the south corridor. And when you arrive there, you have this beautiful town center for that upmarket housing, but it's totally empty. That's what it looks like. There's only one interior designer, one wedding planner. And the point is that whilst the developer has already sold all the units to the very happy owners, he's not inclined to find the people to rent the shops in his town center. And this is what happens now. We've got that beautiful pseudo-Romanesque townscape, and it's totally a ghost town, and it's a great deal of wastage. And when you let market forces drive development, as much as they can turn out to be very exciting developments. Now what happens to London? Let's look at that. That's the master plan with the shards in the background. Next slide, please. This is old news. This is 201. I think the situation might be more drastic now. And what were they looking about? Look at the value system of the British. They've got a migrant population. I was going to talk about this. One of the situations that affects vibrancy. Yeah? Look at the color code. This is the value system. Green belt, areas of outstanding natural beauty, ancient woodlands, must save, must preserve. Then the people that come in, we have to spread them around and not break up all these open spaces. Open space is premium, very important. And actually, they are important to vibrant economies. Let's move on. Migrant population. Now, this is the story of Shenzhen. I'll have a read in the figure, but in the context of China, 50% of 600 million people live in urban conditions. And for China, 124,000 square kilometers of arable land has been lost due to urban expansion from 1980 to 2008. In Shenzhen alone, the population is 310,000. It was 310,000 in 1979, until Deng Xiaoping said, all right, let's do an experiment with the SEZ, the Shenzhen Socio-Economic Zone. And we'd let the people who own the farmland become their own private investors. And overnight, they built all these apartments. There were extrusions from their little plots of land. So you've got 310,000 people originally in 1979 in Shenzhen, and now in 2009, the figure is 14 million. Now, the land area in Shenzhen in 1979 then was 20 square kilometers, and now it's 813 square kilometers. Next slide. What do we have here? And you see in the black and white pictures, you find that the tall towers behind have in the foreground the lower urban villages. And what they offer cheap rental rooms for the blue-collar workers. And really, this is important to sustain, if you like, the smaller informal economy feeding the bits of the formal businesses. Now, you find here that the urban village is surrounded by high-rise buildings, right? The main street of an urban village is shown there in slide number 2. You see slide number 2 is very narrow. You call them handshake towers. You open your window and shake the hands of the next person in the opposite block. Now, the very interesting thing here is that the SEZ zone is 5,000 persons per square kilometer. And you see here the kitchens spill out on the back streets, little bits of courtyards for games. And it's actually a lot more exciting than this one. This one is dead in the night, but that's the modern vision. They are going to wipe out all of that because that's seen as unhealthy, squalor. And they replace most of China with this. And maybe one has to ask, is there a way with which you could encourage and sustain this kind of vibrancy without looking at it as purely unhealthy environment conditions? Next slide. I bring you now to Kumatuli, and what we do in Kolkata. In 0.1 kilometer of a little part of Kolkata, it's a potter's colony that has been there for years. It's called Kumatuli. Kuma means potter, am I right? Yeah, to make things with clay. And they house 2,400 persons at peak production to turnover, US 65 million per year. Not bad, considered maybe in the same league as Silicon Valley. But here's the point. You look at that, the workshops are all piled with bamboo, clay. They take the clay from the Hooghly River, they make it up figurines, and then it's a Puya, the festival, they take it on the boat and put it back again. But a large portion gets exported to Europe where they pay a premium price. That's where you get a $65 million from. But overnight, in a season, when the Puya starts, the festival starts, the occupancy of a workshop changes from 4 people to 40. And 40 people cram the same space for 4. Okay, next slide. Now, what's happening in Singapore? I was just remarking to my colleagues here, thank goodness we've got this wonderful air-conditioned space with the hostile climate here. And maybe we are very much influenced by climate. I think if you go to Beijing, you'll be running from MRT station to MRT station because it's air-conditioned. And here, I think because of our fear of ultraviolet heat and sun, we have become a mall-centric culture. Everything that you see here, that's a music competition for children, that's IKEA, that's looks like a mini football promotion somewhere in West Coast Centre, that's somewhere in Chinatown. This is Singapore's proof that we are very strong-minded people. If you put your hands long enough over 4 days, the last man standing, you win a Subaru, and it's outside Taka, our version of Vibrancy. And even then, you have skating rinks all the way in MBS to JQ in Jurong now. We are all mall-centric. So that's missing. That's the Singapore Air Show in Changi. This you'll recognize in Somerset. Are these dribs and drabs of leftover informal spaces? Or should they be something that we should look at? Yeah? Are we only driven by commercial promotions versus free space to play? Every square kilometer is not yours, actually. It belongs to a landlord. Next slide. How do you have a public policy to allow more free space to play? Now, all these are actually in Chengdu and Shenzhen. Yeah, parts in Nanjing. That, of course, is, for those of you homesick, near Greenwich, Maze Hill in winter. I happened to be there one winter. And this very strange thing happens in a Changi airport terminal when there's so much floor space that sometimes they're unoccupied. And some people actually go there and use it, and they don't get chased away by some security guard. And I think this is very important in Singapore. If you could have maybe a lot of outside spaces, if you do have freedom, flexible spaces, if you do have spaces where actually people just come along and use, they occupy. I think here in these cities, for the longest time, people don't bother to go all the way to a central park, which is kilometers away, but they actually use an open patch of ground, a forecourt in front of a building, and they do whatever they need to do with their hobby group. And that's very interesting. It's a very informal city, quite different from what people think of China. Next slide, please. Now then, here comes the issue. The space, as I said, is controlled. Some landlord. And who are the biggest culprits? Excuse me, can you please switch off your radio? It's getting too loud. It's 10 p.m. I'm going to call the security guard. We are a very intolerant society. We are the ones that put up these signs, not the landlord, not the government. And the government and the police and the security guards all have to act. So here you find, this is what happened when there was, when you had a worker in Little India who was run over by a bus. And smack on, it's a ban on public consumption of alcohol in Little India. But that goes with the alcohol tax. It'll happen in Zouk, it'll happen in a hotel. If someone breaks up in a fight, license is revoked. In other parts of the world, Malaysia, you have wonderful crossings. We do have an eco bridge now, right, to help animals cross. I don't know if the animals actually cross that bridge, but I must try it one day. This is near Changi, and apparently there are crazy people who point laser guns at the planes. I know there's a hobby about plane spotting, but pointing laser guns, I don't know. So maybe that sign is justified, but here you find that maybe we are looking for less restricted usage. A very ordinary HDB slab block is encouraging rappelling, climbing. Maybe that's the way to go, you know. Very interesting point here. That's my youngest son there, standing in part of a leftover space in HDB of a signboard. There are leftover spaces in some of our models of HDB flats. They're not being used, but yet there are restrictions on them. Maybe this is a way to imaginatively allow much more spontaneous use of those spaces. Next slide. Now I'll take you to West Malaysia. Did you know that, we were saying one day that if you take a drive to Malaysia, blood pressure comes down because you see all that green, right? But you know that green, it's not native to Malaysia. The only things that are native to Malaysia are going to be chopped down. The ones that you see on the roadside and motorways, they are all agricultural. They switched from rubber because Brazil outpriced Malaysia, so they went to palm oil. And then in all the agricultural and scientific experiments, the search for fast-growing, high-yield timber brought certain species. Time. I'll finish very soon. And so the Honduras pine was killing all the other species, and this architect decided to make something out of it, which would be some form of interpretive center. If you go to Cameron Highlands, where we get most of our vegetables, the global warming there is fantastic. That's because we need the plastic sheets to put them in the greenhouses, and our food demand is actually 4 minutes global warming. Lunchtime in Cameron Highlands now is equivalent to the temperature of Singapore. You don't have the cool highlands anymore. Yeah, that you find on the road, it happens all the time. They're roadkill, and that's very sad. Next slide. Okay, we'll skip that. I want to tell you the story of the Menteri Besar landing in Desaru with a flight of horses. Yeah, maybe should buildings be more convertible, because the lesson from Barcelona after the Olympics was that they went broke because all the loan that went into building the stadiums, they couldn't redeploy them and use them for other functions. So now all the latest generation stadiums have built-in flexibility to use them for other kind of activities to sustain their usefulness. Maybe all buildings should be convertible. Next slide. We're familiar with this one? Anybody give a shout? Have you seen this? The Singapore's first turf club. After we relocated to Kranji, we made use of the old buildings for these purposes. And maybe this is really fun. Football, yeah, the whole work. That's a pet hotel. You need to go on a holiday, put your dog there, they'll take care of it. Thriving business. Singapore American School, Tanglin Prep School, they all play on the grounds right at the end. Next slide. Well, I was going to get into Cambridge and shared spaces. The same commons is actually where you grow the beef, the beautiful red Paul stock. By the river, there are boat houses. And then you've got these tremendously fit jocks that row all times of the year. And that makes a very interesting place. It's not Sleepy Hollow. It's not a lot of people, but it's vibrant. Okay? I'll fast forward now and skip this lot. And we go next. Now, maybe it is very useful to have huge urban voids. Those of you who know this, that's Little Manila in the bottom of Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank in Hong Kong. And every weekend, because there's no space in the small apartments of the Hong Kong dwellers, the city has mandated that every public space should be given up to the people who need to use it. Yeah. And so then, in our place, our neck of the woods, we use this also to stage our dragon boat dances. The old colonial hang-up of the Singapore Recreation Club and Cricket Club claims a large portion of the Padang. It's not shareable. And neither is this golf course next to Belaya. You don't know whether you can get to that or not. Maybe there's something to think about. Next slide. We'll skip this. Actually, I was very interested in the point that a very important part of the city is creative vibrancy. And so, how do we plan a city? How do we plan our campuses? As engines of creative vibrancy. And this is what we think. This is a science fair for O and A level students next to the London Flyer. This you will find in every German institute. It's a robotic land mower. And I won't tell you what the rest are because that's top secret, by one of our local engineering firms that do very interesting work for the military. Next slide. Yeah, we can stop. I'll just summarize at this point here. Yeah, 2 minutes. Well, if you remember Bernard Schumi, who mentioned that in his architecture is not about the conditions of design, but about the design of conditions. You might disagree with him, you might agree with him, but if you look at the slides, this is something to think about. But really more than other cultural disciplines, we are confronted with the most diverse levels of complexity. And I think the important question to ask is which context generates which concept of complexity, and what concept of complexity produces what context. I have a last slide. Okay, next slide. Promise. Okay, this one. We got this from a joint UK commission, top universities, and they're looking at the urban solutions for peri-urban estates in UK. And really the problem was balancing the energy consumed in transport and a growing population. If you look at the goals and the principles, sure, everybody knows what they are. Very straightforward, very simple. But you know what? This is a dream. It's a dream because you can put it on paper, but it is very difficult to achieve. And maybe on that note, I'd like to end the presentation. Thank you.